Hello and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for our Metro Sepulveda Transit Corridor Lunchtime webinar. We're going to be starting our presentation momentarily. My name is Matthew Marquez, Community Relations Officer for LA Metro. We're actually going to begin today's meeting with a
Bienvenidos a todos. Vamos a comenzar.
quick audience poll question. Sorry for the interruption, everybody. First off, I want to thank everybody for joining us. We already have over 150 people on the line on today's webinar, so thank you all for joining us and taking your lunch hour to join us. We're going to go ahead and start our poll question. We'd really like to know where everyone is joining us from today. So shortly on your screen, you're going to see a poll pop up, and I'm going to go ahead and open the poll now. Our first question is pretty easy. Where do you live? Where are you joining us from today? Is it the San Fernando Valley, the West Side, maybe Central LA or downtown, San Gabriel Valley, South LA, Gateway Cities, maybe in the North County, Santa Clarita, Palmdale area, South Bay, or are you joining us from outside of LA County? We're going to give everyone a minute to go ahead and put in their responses in the poll, and then we'll release the results. Excellent. We'll give everyone a couple more seconds to put in their responses in the poll, and then we'll go ahead and release the results. Everyone about 15 more seconds. Okay, let's go ahead and share those results. Great. Looks like we have about 40% of today's audience joining us from the San Fernando Valley, as well as 27%, about 44 of you joining us from the West Side. We also have some representation from the Central LA, downtown LA area, as well as some from the South Bay as well too. And we also have some people from outside of LA County, but looks like we have people joining us from all over LA County today, which is great to hear, great to see. Thank you all for joining us during today's meeting, and thank you for sharing your input with us. All right, go ahead and go to the next slide. Great, so before we get started with today's webinar, I would like to review some housekeeping items for today. Spanish interpretation is available during today's meeting. To access Spanish interpretation, you can click on the interpretation icon, which will be made available very shortly, and you can select the audio. The interpretation icon is up on the screen, and you can select the audio of the language that you would like to listen to today. A copy of today's presentation translated into Spanish is also being made available in the chat function as well too. Now I would like to introduce today's Spanish interpreter, Diana Orozco, who will also provide these directions in Spanish. Diana?
Sí, buenas tardes. Para aquellos que estén presentes el día de hoy y desean escuchar esta presentación en español, estas son las siguientes instrucciones que usted debe de seguir. Esta sesión se está llevando a cabo por medio de Zoom y lo que tiene que hacer es hacer el clic en el icono que dice interpretación. Escoja la opción para escuchar en español. Luego, el enlace a la presentación en español está disponible en el chat. Gracias.
Great. Thank you so much, Diana. Next slide. Excellent. So during today's webinar, all attendees' cameras and microphones will be off and on mute. That means the audience as well as panelists are not going to be able to see you or hear you during today's webinar. Today's meeting is being recorded and will be available following today's presentation on our project website. We, of course, welcome questions from the audience during today's presentation. To submit a question during today's presentation, please type in your questions using the Q&A function. The icon is there on the screen on your Zoom menu. At the conclusion of today's presentation, we will have time for Q&A facilitated by our project team. Project staff will attempt to answer as many questions as they can within the hour. Verbal questions will not be taken during today's presentation. We want to make sure that today's webinar is a safe environment for all, and we ask that everyone remain respectful during today's meeting. If you are experiencing any issues during today's meeting that require technical support, staff is on hand to assist you. For any technical support, you can call or text the number on your screen, 213-600-9039. I also do want to note that today's meeting does have closed captioning and live transcriptions available on the screen. Next slide. I would also like to take the opportunity to introduce our project team and today's speakers. So once again, I am Matthew Marquez, Community Relations Officer with LA Metro. While I am a new face to the project, I bring over 7 years of engagement and outreach experience on planning, design and construction projects for LA Metro, and I look forward to being part of this critical infrastructure project. Also joining me today is our project manager, Peter Carter with Countywide Planning and Development. Also joined by transportation planner, Jackie Sue with Countywide Planning and Development. Lastly, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Senior Manager, Karen Swift with Community Relations, who will discuss the Sepulveda corridor then and now and review today's agenda. Karen?
Thanks, Matthew. It's so great to be with all of you today. Thank you for spending your lunch hour with us. It's been a couple of years since we last held a community meeting. It was the summer of 2019. So looking at our next slide, we brought a few pictures for you today to just remind you of what the corridor was like then, and then what's happened in the meantime. So we've been really busy here at Metro for the last 2 years, and we're going to share with you what we've been doing. And then we've all been really busy, and profoundly impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. So just a few photos there along the bottom to show how our world has changed. So we trust that all of you have been safe and healthy during this difficult time. And we want to give a special shout out to all of our essential workers and frontline employees, particularly here at Metro, and all of our transit riders and employees who kept the system going throughout the pandemic. So we look forward to brighter days ahead for our nation and our state. Next slide. So we do have a very full lunch hour for you today. And again, thank you for spending your day with us. I know that there is always a tremendous desire for information around this project. And if I had offered a day-long workshop, many of you would have gladly signed up for it. But today we have a lunchtime. So we're going to move quickly today and recap our transit feasibility study. Peter's going to walk us through that. We're going to talk about what's coming up in terms of environmental review, and then we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A today. And Matthew explained how to work that function. So with that, I will turn it back over to Jackie for a quick poll.
Thanks, Karen. Hi, everyone. This is Jackie Sue. I've been working on the project for a few years now through the feasibility study, and it's really great to be with you all today to talk about the project. If we haven't met before, it's great to meet you. So we have a Zoom poll here for you, and what we'd like to know is, before the pandemic, how often did you travel through the 405 corridor? Was it 5 days a week, once or twice a week, once or twice a month, or as infrequently as possible? So please let us know. And we're going to wait a few seconds to gather your responses. And we'll close the poll in about 5 more seconds. All right, let's close the poll and share results. So it looks like 22% of respondents travel through the corridor 5 days a week. Another 22% travel through once or twice a week. 32% travel through once or twice a month, and 24% as infrequently as possible. So thank you for participating. And now I'll turn it over to Peter to discuss background milestones.
Great, thank you, Jackie, and good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Peter Carter, and I'm a Senior Director in Metro's Countywide Planning and Development Department. I've been working on this project since the beginning of the feasibility study, and I'll be with you for the entirety of the environmental phase as project manager. We'll start off with background milestones as a way for providing some context for the rest of today's presentation. And the Sepulveda Transit Corridor project really became a tangible reality in 2016 when the voters of LA County approved the Measure M plan, including its expenditure plan, which identified funding for the project. Shortly thereafter, staff conducted a feasibility study, and that feasibility study concluded by identifying alternatives for further study. At the same time, Metro's Office of Extraordinary Innovation was looking into public-private partnerships for several metro projects, including Sepulveda. The specific type of public-private partnership that was suggested for Sepulveda was something called a pre-development agreement, which would bring ideas from the private sector into the process earlier during the environmental phase. Next few milestones here are contract awards. So in August of 2020, the Metro Board approved the environmental contract award, followed by the outreach contract award in December of 2020, and the PDA contract awards in March of 2021. And the last milestone shown here is the Metro Board receipt of the alternatives for environmental review in April of this year. Next slide, please. So this graphic gives us a high-level overview of the project schedule. And we've completed our feasibility study and the procurements necessary to begin the environmental phase. Within the environmental phase, the PDA contractor teams and the environmental contractor will be developing alternatives. Those alternatives will be subject to state and federal environmental review. Those alternatives will be refined, and eventually the Metro Board will identify a preferred project, a locally preferred alternative that will be further engineered for potential delivery as a public-private partnership. Next slide, please. So where are we? We have just completed the early planning work. We're getting ready for environmental review, to be followed by further engineering, eventual construction, and finally operation. Next slide, please. So the next few slides, we'll talk a little bit about what went into the decision about alternatives for environmental review. And we'll start by talking a little bit about the feasibility study. And what we have here is something of a vision statement that we used on the feasibility study for identifying alternatives. And there's a few things here that are worth noting. The first is an acknowledgement of the large and growing travel market between the San Fernando Valley, the West Side, and LAX. And there's also an acknowledgement that in order for transit to be competitive with travel by car, that transit needs to be fast, frequent, high enough capacity to meet those existing and future needs. It needs to be reliable, and it needs to be well connected to the rest of our metro system. The next slide, please. And here's a bit of an overview of the feasibility study that was conducted between 2017 and 2019. We split the study area into two parts based on that measure and expenditure plan, which had the valley to west side portion in the north slated for delivery from 2033 to 35, and the west side to LAX portion of the study area slated for delivery a little bit later in 2057 to 59. We were looking at high capacity transit concepts that connected to existing and planned transit corridors at the level of alignments, station locations, and potential maintenance and storage facility sites. We had 3 rounds of public meetings, and in December of 2019, we submitted our findings to the Metro Board. And you can take a look at the feasibility report, which was produced at the end of that study. There's a copy at our project website, which is metro.net/projects/Sepulveda corridor. And now Karen will talk a little bit about outreach during the feasibility study.
Thanks, Peter. So during the feasibility study, we did have a lot of outreach. So we came out to you all at different points when we had new information to share. So we did that in a variety of different ways. We did flyering, there were print ads, there was lots of media coverage. I'm sure we have some folks from the media joining us today. We held 10 public meetings with over 1,000 people, but I'm happy to share you all have bested even our biggest attendance during the feasibility study. We have over 300 people logged into this webinar right now, and I think the most we ever had was about 250 people during a live meeting. So I just wanted to share that today. We did a lot of outreach at our transit stations, and that was really critical for us to be able to engage with future riders of this line, and that'll be something that you hear me talk about later in the presentation today. And we did a lot of great events out in the community, whether it was the Sherman Oaks Street Fair, Pic Pico, lots of community fairs and festivals in all points north, south, and around the Sepulveda corridor. So we look forward to doing that again. And then throughout the study, you told us what you thought. So as we shared new information with you, you responded to that. And in the end, we got over 1,200 comments during the feasibility study. We put out 2 online surveys, which were another really great way to reach you all. We had over 10,000 responses. So we're looking forward to equal levels, or maybe perhaps better levels of participation as we go forward from here. And I will turn it to Jackie.
Thanks, Karen. Hi, everyone. It's Jackie again, and it's time for another Zoom poll. Next slide, please. And this is our last poll. And what we would like to know is, did you participate in the feasibility study? So did you attend a meeting, take an online survey, submit comments, or did you participate through a combination of these ways? And if that's the case, you can select multiple answers for this question. If you did not participate during the feasibility study, we'd like to know that as well and welcome you to our project. So please let us know. Let's wait a few seconds to gather responses. And we're going to close the poll in about 5 more seconds. Okay, let's close the poll and share results. So it looks like 37 of respondents attended a meeting, 33% took an online survey, 24% submitted comments, and 44% did not participate. So welcome, and thank you for sharing. And now I'll pass it over to Peter to discuss the Valley to West Side alternatives from the feasibility study.
Great, thank you, Jackie. Well, it's great to see that so many of you were involved in the feasibility study and continue to remain engaged, and great to see that we've got a lot of new folks with us as well. So if you were with us during the feasibility study, these maps will be familiar. These are the 4 alternatives that we ended up with at the end of that study. And I'm going to talk about them today in terms of their core elements, because those core elements are still with us in the alternatives for environmental review. So we looked at, in these 4 alternatives, options for traveling between the valley and the west side by going under the Santa Monica Mountains using heavy rail. We looked at going over the mountains using monorail. We looked at a northern terminus, an end of the line in the north at the Ventura County Metrolink line at Van Nuys Boulevard. We looked at both alignments along Sepulveda Boulevard and Van Nuys Boulevard in the north. We looked at connections to both Bundy and Sepulveda on the Expo line. And we looked at vertical configurations that are underground, that are elevated, and that are at grade. Next slide, please. So another input to our alternatives for environmental review was the pre-development agreement process. And we talked a little bit about how the Metro Board had approved the use of the pre-development agreement model in 2019. The basic idea is that Metro will be working with teams who are interested in constructing the projects as a public-private partnership, and ideas that these private sector teams have about project efficiencies can become part of their designs from the very beginning. Next slide, please. And if you were with us in February and March for the PDA contract awards, you would have seen these illustrations. These are concepts, not alternatives, depictions of what the project might be from the perspective of those procurement documents. And on the left, we have a monorail alternative that is fully elevated between the valley and the west side and operates within the middle of the 405. And on the right, we have an alternative that goes under the Santa Monica Mountains between the valley and the west side using heavy rail and is elevated along Sepulveda Boulevard in the north. Next slide, please. So these are the 5 alternatives for environmental review, and I'll go through each of these briefly. Alternative 1 is a monorail alternative, as we saw proposed through the PDA process. Alternative 2 is also a monorail alternative, the difference being that this alternative has a connection to UCLA and uses an underground alignment in order to make that connection to UCLA. Alternative 3 is a heavy rail alternative, as we saw on the previous slide, that was proposed through the PDA process. And you may have also noticed that that alignment is similar to HRT3, which came out of the feasibility study. Alternative 4 is a heavy rail alternative that is similar to alternative 3. The difference being that alternative 4 takes that section along Sepulveda Boulevard in the north and puts it underground. Also similar to HRT2 from the feasibility study. And alternative 5 is also heavy rail going underground between the valley and the west side, focusing on the Van Nuys Boulevard corridor in the north, and similar to HRT1 from the feasibility study. So those are the 5 alternatives for environmental review. Next slide, please. So if you were with us during the feasibility study, you heard us talk a lot about the environmental phase and all the information that would be available at that time. And so for each of those 5 alternatives, Metro will be leading the environmental analysis, and that environmental analysis will include a careful evaluation of each of the alternatives. We'll produce environmental documents, the first of which will be a draft DIR, a draft environmental impact report, and there'll be a lot of information in that document. We'll have information about each of the alternatives, about their alignments, where their stations are located, how they connect to the rest of the metro network. We'll have information about the benefits of the different alternatives, how they help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, how they help to reduce traffic congestion, as well as how the different alternatives fit into their surrounding neighborhoods. So what are these projects going to, these potential alternatives going to look like? What are these alternatives going to sound like? What are they going to feel like? These are all the sorts of things that will be included in the environmental review and documented. Now, Karen will talk a little bit about public participation during environmental review.
Thanks, Peter. And I do want to pause just for a second because we're getting a number of questions today about whether this meeting is being recorded. Yes, it is. And the meeting is being recorded, and we will provide the recording in both English and Spanish on our project website, possibly later this week, but probably early next, because we have to have both recordings available in both languages to be able to share. So you'll have access to the recording with all these slides in front of you just as soon as we can get it all boxed up and put it on the Metro website. So with that, let me turn back to this slide and talk about your participation, because your participation is going to be critical to a successful environmental review process for Metro. And we're going to have a number of ways for you to get involved, to provide your comments, to share information with you. We're going to ask you to help us understand what we should study. And I'm seeing some of those questions come in already today about the topics that are really important to you all. So we're going to have a scoping period this fall. It's going to be noticed. It's going to be shared with you. We're going to work through all of our different channels to make sure you're aware of that information. And then we'll have a draft environmental impact report, as Peter shared. And so that will be another opportunity where we come back to you with a full report that I know many of you will look forward to downloading and reading cover to cover, but that is going to have a lot of the information to the questions that I see you're already bringing up today. There'll be a public hearing process for you to share your comments on that. So this, again, today is the beginning of our process again as we get back underway, but certainly there will be lots of key milestones for public input as we go forward. Next slide. So as our state opens back up and the world begins to return to some version of a different environment for us, we do expect to hold more public meetings. I don't know if we'll cram you into the Marvin Browdy Center like the photo down there below, but certainly we will be back out to meet with you in some person. Again, this webinar has proved really effective. We have almost 340 people now logged into the meeting right now. So we see that this has been a great way to reach many of you, and we thank you for your participation. We hope to be back out talking to transit riders, as I mentioned earlier. Transit station outreach and outreach to our transit riders is really, really critical for this project. And then surveys. So again, we'll probably plan to share some online surveys with you all and have lots of different strategies to make sure that we're communicating with you about the information on the project and that we're getting your feedback back to Metro so that we can continue to refine the project with your public input. Next slide. So with that, we're going to stop our presentation. We're going to transition over to Q&A. So as we have shared, there are a couple of ways you can submit Q&A today. You can submit it using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. And I see a number of you have already figured out how to use that function. And then we will start posting some of those live as we are either answering them live as I'm asking Peter them and he'll be answering, or we're responding to a few of them in writing as we can. Some of those that are comments, we'll probably just respond and say thank you for your comment and move on. If you're having any difficulties with the Q&A function, or if you're dialed in by phone today, you are welcome to text your question to our line at 213-600-0985. 9039. Again, that's 213-600-9039. And our team will get it and I will see it and we will have Peter answer it. So with that, Peter, I'm not going to waste any time and we're going to get right into it. And so to talk about the Q&A. So the first question I want to relay to you is, what is happening with the west side to LAX alternative? So during the feasibility study, we had studied west side to LAX. Where did those alternatives fit into this process and where we are? So can you talk a little bit about the work done during the feasibility study for those who are new today, and then kind of where we go from here from west side to LAX?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So we did study the full extent of the Sepulveda Transit Corridor study area. As you saw that map with the big long section in our earlier slides, we studied a component that got all the way to the airport. And if you're interested in seeing the alternatives that we studied at that time, you can see the feasibility report that we referenced, which describes those alternatives and various performance metrics associated with them. You may also remember me saying that the Measure M expenditure plan has that southern portion slated for delivery, not opening until much later than the northern portion. So the west side to LAX portion is scheduled to open within the 2057 to 59 timeframe. And so because it's happening later, we're not studying it now during environmental review. However, of course, none of the alternatives for environmental review that we'll be studying during the environmental phase will preclude an extension to LAX. So all of them can and will be eventually extended to the airport.
Thanks. A clarification question today from one of our attendees. When we say Sepulveda corridor, what does that area mean? Does it mean all the routes parallel to the 405, or when we say the words over and over again, Sepulveda Transit Corridor, what do we mean by that geographical area?
Yeah, it's a question that we'll be answering with more specificity as we move along within the environmental phase. So one of the things that folks have probably noticed, and which may even be a little bit frustrating, is that there are no depictions of any of the alternatives that we've mentioned or the study area even. And these are things that will be coming to us during the scoping period later this year in the fall of 2021. So when we talk about the Sepulveda corridor, we're typically talking about people who are traveling between the valley and the west side using the 405 or adjacent corridors.
Great. Thank you, Peter. So I'm seeing a number of questions coming in about property acquisition. And so I know this is an area where a lot of people are concerned, and we've seen some misinformation out there already, given where we are in the environmental process, but we understand that people are worried. Can you provide a little bit of explanation on how the project will look at property acquisition going forward and sort of provide some assurances, I think, to folks who are really worried about what might be happening right this second?
Yeah, well, I think the important thing to start with is to say that we at Metro take property acquisition very seriously. It's not something that we take lightly at all. And we think about it from the very beginning of our process as each of these different alternatives is designed. That being said, we also don't want to come out with information that is premature and that unnecessarily alarms people. And so what we try to do is make available the information we have about potential property acquisition as soon as we can. And so the draft environmental impact report, which we described, will talk about alignments and talk about the extent of potential property acquisition. And our goal is, to the extent that it's necessary, potentially necessary, that we make that information available to people as soon as we possibly can.
Great, thank you. One question that we got today is how would, let's see, sorry, I went a little bit faster. So let's see, one question that I want to ask you is what are the criteria and their relative value that will be used to make decisions about the project as we go forward? And what will the evaluation of those criteria, like how will we share sort of the evaluation criteria with the public as we move forward during the environmental process?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that are unique about this project. It's interesting and complex in a variety of ways. And fortunately, the selection of the preferred project or the locally preferred alternative will happen in ways that are familiar to people, because it'll be the same way that it happens on every other metro project. So the milestones to keep in mind are the milestones that we've described in today's presentation. So the preferred project will be selected by the Metro Board following the publication of the draft environmental impact report and the public comment on that draft environmental impact report. In terms of what goes into that report, that's going to be informed by our scoping period. So the scoping period is when Metro shares with the public what we're intending to take into that process of creating that document, and we're receiving public comment on that as well. So the public can make sure that we're including in that, the drafting of that report, everything that they want to see included. So those two milestones, the scoping period and the production of the draft environmental impact report, will be preceding the selection of a preferred project. And as with all of our projects, that selection will be very public and transparent, and something that the general public will be a part of.
Thanks, Peter. One of the questions we have today, and I think we kind of explained this, but maybe we can just touch on it again, is why, didn't Metro look at building this project back when we were expanding the 405? So why did we do that work back then? And now here we are today, and we're doing a different process. And I think it's because we have Measure M and we have an environmental review process, but can you just sort of touch on sort of how we do these projects in different orders a little bit, or why we are where we are right now?
Yeah, I think you're right, Karen, that part of the answer is about funding. So as I mentioned, there's been thoughts about a potential transit connection between the Valley and the West Side for many years. And it became a reality within our reach after the voters of LA County approved Measure M in its expenditure plan, which identified funding, quite a bit of funding to be used for that purpose. I think an important point to make here is that a lot of work has been done within the 405 in the past, and a lot of work will continue to be done. There are several different projects that are working within this same space. And as you and I, Karen, know, we are coordinating with all of those projects on a very regular basis. And it's not always something that folks who are joining us at these meetings can see, but it's important for them to know that there is a high degree of coordination among all the Metro projects that are working within this space.
Thanks, Peter. We have a question from Sherman Oaks that I know we heard a lot during the feasibility study, and this is certainly a concern on the Valley side. So the question is, why do you have an alternative above ground in the Valley, but yet it's below ground on the West side? And, concerns about sort of, why is one up and one is down, and how is that fair, or how is that equitable? And I know we heard that a lot, but I think if we can just sort of touch on the range of alternatives that we have, that would be great.
Yeah, so Metro currently operates an elevated transit line on the west side. The Expo line is elevated in that grade. And we have an alternative within the 5 alternatives for environmental review for this project, the Sepulveda Transit Corridor project, that is elevated for its entirety. So alternative 1 is elevated all the way from its northern terminus in the Valley to its southern terminus at the Expo line. There is no prohibition against having an elevated line on the west side. The primary criterion is physical availability of space. So as we said during the feasibility study, we took a look at different vertical configurations, as we call them, where that was possible. And there was more space available in the Valley. And so that's why there are elevated area lines, segments of the lines being considered in the Valley.
Thanks. We have a couple of follow-up questions on the LAX connection, and I understand that when you see numbers that have the decade 2050 in it, it's a little bit sobering and discouraging to some of our attendees today. And so people are wondering, is there any process by which some of those dates for the later part of the project might be accelerated, or anything that we would be considering or looking at as part of that process?
Um, and help me out here, Karen, if I'm not quite answering the question, but
Right.
one thing that I don't think has come up yet is the 28 by 2028 plan. And this is a plan to deliver 28 metro projects in time for the 2028 Olympic and Paralympic Games in Los Angeles. And the Valley West Side portion of the Sepulveda Transit Corridor project is on that list of 28 projects. And this is a goal that Metro and staff remain committed to. And our engagement with the PDA process and potential delivery of this project as a public-private partnership, those are some of the ways that we're endeavoring to meet that goal of an earlier delivery of the project.
Thank you. So this is a question that I know some folks have had online. And so um, one of the questions that we have today is, why would Metro be considering alternatives that lack a connection to UCLA when the feasibility study talked about the connectivity to UCLA? And I know that's something that's been a little bit confusing for people. And I think, again, the range of alternatives we have gets at that. But can you just speak a little bit about how we sort of got from 4 and 2 to 5 and how we kind of accounted for that?
So when Metro's Office of Extraordinary Innovation put together the request for proposals for PDA contractors, they didn't want to be overly prescriptive. They wanted the private sector to be able to express to Metro what they thought might be the best concepts for delivering the project. And as you mentioned in the question about why are we considering elevated lines in certain places, it's important that we think about the full range of alternatives, that no one alternative is going to touch on all the different possible things that the project could be. And as we think about what a reasonable range might be, it's important to realize that 4 out of the 5 alternatives do include that connection to UCLA.
Thanks, Peter. How will you be coordinating with Caltrans as we go forward? So we had coordinated with Caltrans, I know, during the feasibility study, and when we're talking about an alternative in the middle of the freeway, that feels like an important element of our coordination going forward. So how will you coordinate with both Caltrans and all the other public agencies that touch the project at different connection points, whether that's the Metrolink connection up in the north or transit riders? I mean, how are you going to work with public agencies throughout the environmental process?
So those of our attendees who were with us during the feasibility study know that we've already begun coordinating with Caltrans and a number of other different agencies already during the feasibility study, and that will continue into the environmental phase as well. Certainly to the extent that that Caltrans, who's responsible for the 405, is a major stakeholder and is watching with great interest what's going on with our project. There's going to be a lot of conversations between us. I'll also point out that a related project, the 405 Express Lanes, is working in close coordination with Caltrans on their work, and so that's another way that Caltrans is involved. But they will certainly be a stakeholder, and it's certainly part of our regular established process of working closely with interested and affected agencies.
Thanks, Peter. Got a question from one of our longtime stakeholders of this project and other projects, which is Faramars. Thank you, Faramars, for being here. He is wondering what opportunities exist for stakeholders to advocate for different stations or different alignments or modifications. How can stakeholders really share their input with us on what they'd like to see and where they think some of this work and alignments and stations should go as we move forward from here?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Karen, the outreach during the environmental phase is ongoing, and there's also a few specific milestones that we'll be receiving feedback from, and we'll be receiving feedback during those milestones. And uh, the process during the environmental phase is cumulative. So the attempt is not to we're not going to be, the feasibility study that we conducted helped us to narrow down, all of the myriad things that the project could be down to a reasonable range of alternatives. And that work wasn't done in a vacuum. That work was done in a very public way over the course of 2 years. And that work was inclusive of public feedback and comment. And so we don't want to disregard that work. We want to build on it and move ourselves forward toward eventually realizing a project. And so if someone is interested in providing us with feedback on what's going into the environmental document, the time to do that is the public comment period, the scoping period. The scoping period is when we'll be determining the content of that environmental document to be prepared. And then after that environmental document has been completed, the draft EIR, the draft environmental impact report, there will be a public hearing, and that's another opportunity. I'd say that's an especially helpful opportunity for the public because there's going to be a lot of information in there. And to the extent that individuals are interested in providing informed feedback to people at Metro and decision makers, it's going to be a great resource for providing those comments.
Thank you. Here's a question from someone at UCLA. In addition to the environmental review, is there a worldwide environmental scan of transit systems? So I know we cast a very wide net during the feasibility study where you did look around the world. Can you talk a little bit about what you looked at sort of worldwide and then how we got here and kind of whether we're still looking at the world or whether we're looking at a slightly smaller world here in LA County going forward?
So yeah, so we did take a fairly broad view of things, and there's there's a lot of different technologies that are out there, and we looked at all of them. Something that I can recommend to folks who are interested in that scan is to take a look at the documents we have available on the project website. So we discussed the different technologies that were considered in a screening report that's available on our website, and they can read about them there. And we were thinking about, different things that these different technologies could offer. So are certain technologies, for example, better at climbing mountains? So the steepness and the length of the grade, the steepness of the mountain on the valley side of the Sepulveda Pass is a particularly challenging aspect of the project. And are there certain technologies that would make more sense to handle that particular environmental situation? We looked at potential connectivity. For example, we considered whether light rail would be an option. And this was something that was initially intriguing to us. We brought it out to folks during our first public meeting during the feasibility study. And it was intriguing until the analysis had been done, which showed us that trying to connect up the East San Fernando Valley line and the Sepulveda line using light rail, unfortunately, it wasn't going to work. That light rail simply didn't have the capacity to handle the demand that we were seeing in our travel forecasts. And so light rail was eliminated because it didn't have that necessary capacity. So we looked at a variety of different technologies that are used in a variety of different places around the world. And again, I recommend the screening report on our project website for those interested in reading more about that.
Thanks, Peter. Here's a question about with the heavy rail alternatives terminating at Sepulveda and Expo, are all three alternatives still possible for the future West Side LAX segment? So as we think about how we eventually connect, whether it's Overland or Sepulveda or Centinela or some of those, how will you kind of will we sort of, do the work now, but then think about the future and sort of where it goes from there?
Yeah, so there are, based on the different alignments to the south, from west side to LAX, as we call it, it's easier to get to some of those corridors from certain connections to the Expo line than others. But it's possible to mix and match them anyway. So you can get to any of the corridors that we studied for west side to LAX from either Sepulveda or from Bundy connections on the Expo line.
Thanks. I'll give you a break for a second and take a couple of questions here. One question is, how are we going to be reaching out to vehicle drivers? So I talked a little bit about importance of talking to transit riders, and how are we going to talk to people who currently commute via car through the Sepulveda Transit Corridor area? And so the answer is, we're going to have lots and lots of different outreach strategies to reach you all. So emails. So again, if you're not getting our project emails, please make sure that you are signed up for those. We will be working through our press office. We have press releases, we have website updates, we'll have a new video. So we have lots of different ways to make sure that everyone is staying up to date on the project. And then many of you I know today represent neighborhood councils and homeowners associations. And so we've got elected officials here. So we'll rely on all of you to help us get the word out so that we reach a wide audience that we can. And another question that came in was, how is Metro going to address misinformation that's out there about the project? And so again, for a project of this complexity and this really, really powerful and strong feelings that I'm seeing from many of you in the Q&A today. And so we hear you, and we really want to remind you that Metro is your best source of information on the project. And that's why we're holding this webinar today. And that's why in the chat, you'll see links to the project website. You'll see links to the prior feasibility study. So the information that we share with you today, although it's early, although we don't have all the answers, it is the very best source of information for you. So again, I would just say, please stay up to date with us. Bring us your questions. We'll do our best to answer them. And that's what we're trying to do today. So with that, I will turn back to you, Peter, and ask a couple of questions. A few people are really trying to quantify with those 5 alternatives, how many of those actually do connect to UCLA? Can you just talk a little bit more about the 5 alternatives that you shared earlier? And so, what we know now and what we will be looking at again, because I just see a lot of different questions about, is it going here? Is it going there? Does it stop here? Does it stop there? How do I get a station above ground, underground? And I think people are really anxious to know more. And I know we're just so early.
Yeah, no, and I sympathize with those sentiments. I think we'd all like to know a lot more than we do right now. And the difficulty is that we don't have the information that is to the level of precision that so many people on this call would like. What we can say, based on the generally defined project alternatives, is that 4 of the 5 alternatives connect to the UCLA campus. The only alternative that doesn't connect to the UCLA campus is alternative 1.
Thank you. Let's see. So many questions. I'm trying to get through as many as I can. Let's see. So somebody wants to know, will we be voting on the alternatives? So I like this one. I hate this one. Is there a process for voting? That's not really how the environmental review process works, right? We're not suddenly going to put out a Zoom poll in a year and say, tell us which one you want, right? We're going to put out a whole lot of information and then hope that people give us a whole lot of comments back, right? But can you just sort of talk one more time, I guess, about how that is going to work in real time for people?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And one of the challenges for the project that you and I are both all too familiar with, Karen, is reaching the people who are currently traveling through this corridor and who are going to be served by the ultimate project. And that means reaching out to people in a lot of different ways, and I can let you expand on that a little more. But you're correct that the project will not be decided by a Zoom poll, and that the best way for folks on this call and others to be a part of that decision-making process is to be engaged and understand the work that's going into the project, and to be a part of the scoping period, and to review the draft environmental impact report, and use all of that information to make informed comments to us. You and I are both reading every single comment that comes through. Those comments are also being conveyed to the Metro board. So if people are making comments on the draft environmental impact report, those comments will be seen by everyone. And Metro will actually be responding to them as well. So all comments received on the draft environmental impact report will receive acknowledgement and a response from Metro. Again, it may not seem like it, but again, staff at Metro are seeing every single comment, and the Metro Board of Directors takes public comment very seriously, and does take it into consideration in their decision-making process.
Thanks, Peter. Here's a question that we heard a fair amount during the feasibility study, and it's back again. When Metro has opened new rail lines, a lot of times we have seen that capacity, immediately be very, very high. I mean, even the San Fernando Valley, when the G line, formerly known as the Orange line, first opened, the capacity and the ridership estimates were way above what anybody thought it would be, in the first year. And so as we think about capacity for this project, how will you be thinking about ridership? And so what will be the process, the environmental process for studying how many people are going to ride these alternatives, and how's that going to work so that we really are planning for a system that can handle, the capacity when we open and then beyond?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it's one that we talked a little bit about during the feasibility study as well. Again, thinking of not just meeting the needs of LA County today, but meeting the needs of LA County in the future for generations to come. And the term that we used during the feasibility study was future proofing, and wanting to basically acknowledge that not only is this expected to be a highly successful project at the beginning, but for years to come. And we want to do everything we can to set ourselves up for success. And part of that means doing what we call travel demand forecasting, and doing estimates of ridership. And there are the models that we use are models that we have been using for years on all Metro projects. They're models that are very closely regulated by the Federal Transit Administration. And they give us a pretty good idea of what the project is going to be like. So we're going to give it our best shot. We have a lot of smart folks thinking about these things from a lot of different angles, and we're doing everything we can to make sure that the project is able to serve the demand that we're identifying.
Okay. Thank you. We have a couple of questions in the chat, in the Q&A, about sort of the cost of the project, and there's been some, focus on sort of what are the estimated costs, and then how much funding do we have available. So I know you talked earlier, we have funding available from Measure M. Some folks are wondering, will Metro be pursuing, additional funding like federal funding or state funding? I think all of us are hearing different talk about federal infrastructure plans and programs in Washington, D.C. with the new administration. So how will we be, what is the money we have, how are we going to look at costs through the environmental process? I guess it's three questions. And then are we seeking, additional funding as part of our process as well?
So the official cost estimates for the alternatives haven't yet been determined. The project itself hasn't been selected, so we don't know exactly what the cost of the Sepulveda Transit Corridor project will be. Measure M has identified funding for the project, but Metro has been highly successful at winning grant funding, especially for high-performing projects like Sepulveda, above and beyond what has typically been expected. The Metro board has also recently prioritized the pursuit of grant funding, specifically for Sepulveda, and so I like to think that these factors help to set us up and put us in a good position for funding what the eventual project will be.
Thanks. We have a few questions. And again, this is a theme we heard, people are anxious to see the project built. They are anxious to ride the project. I think we all know that traffic is already starting to come back in the Sepulveda Pass and on the 405. And so, do we have some information that we can share even today about when we think the line might be open, when folks might be able to ride it, when might construction get underway? I mean, do we, or will we be able to have a lot more detail on that? I know we have some aspirational dates with Measure M, and then we have sort of the ordinance dates. So can you just talk a little bit about kind of what we know, again, at this very early stage of the project about when people actually might be able to use the line?
So the Measure M expenditure plan describes the opening of the Valley to West Side portion of Sepulveda within the 2033 to 35 timeframe. And the Valley to West Side portion of the project is also on the 28 by 2028 list of projects for Metro to deliver by 2028. In terms of a project schedule, it's something that we hope to share with people during the scoping period.
Great. And is there an estimate for us on when some of these key decisions will be made? So I'm seeing some questions in the chat about who's going to make the decisions about these alignments, or who's going to make the choices about where the project goes, and what is the process for that? And how can we, I think, kind of provide some assurances to people that this isn't going to take place behind closed doors? No one's going to miss anything. This isn't going to be something that you decide or I decide, right, without the benefit of a lot of public input. And can you just talk a little bit about the role of the Metro Board of Directors and sort of where that falls within the environmental process at some key points? I mean, I don't know if you want to pull up the schedule slide just to kind of walk people back through that, if that's helpful at all.
Yeah. So again, it's a process that will happen in the same way that it happens on every Metro project. It's a process that will happen very transparently. It's a process that will be in full view of the public, and that the public really should be engaged with and should be contributing to by providing their public comments in a variety of ways. And that doesn't mean that you have to cram your thoughts into 60 seconds and try to make them on a mic in front of the Metro board. You can submit your comments in any way you'd like. You can write us a very long essay. You can submit comments at any time and through any variety of media, and those comments will be acknowledged, and they will be part of the information that the Metro board uses to make its decision. As you pointed out, that is a decision that's made by the Metro board, and maybe another thing to consider is that the decision is not already made. The decision is not going to be made tomorrow. There's going to be several years of analysis and evaluation and discussion and feedback from the public, and a lot of time for deliberation about the project itself. So it's not going to be a fast or uninformed decision. There's going to be a lot of information available to those decision makers. And I think what the good news is that folks are already interested. They're already engaged. They already want to know right now, when can we provide a comment? Even if it's a year from now, tell us when that's going to be. And I think part of our message is to say, it's really great to see folks enthusiastic. And please join us at our scoping period in the fall of this year. Please check out the environmental document when it's available. Please provide comments on that environmental document, and share with us your thoughts on what you think the project should be.
Thanks, Peter. Well, I'm looking at the clock and it's 12:57, and I know some people need to get back to work, or they need to get back to class, or wherever they may need to go with their lives. So I want to be respectful. We do have a little bit of time to stay on for some more questions, but just so that for those of you who need to leave, if we could advance to our next to the last slides, I just want to kind of offer a few closing remarks for those people who have to head out. And I want to stress again that this meeting is being recorded, and we will make it available on the project website. We will be emailing you afterwards when it's available in both English and Spanish. So if we can bring the presentation back up and advance to the the last slides, I will walk us through a nearby effort that is getting underway. So you've heard us ask for your patience today as we do some more work internally to be ready to come back to you all with our scoping process and our scoping period and more information. But there is a project that's getting underway this summer that I think will be of great interest to many of you based on your comments and questions today, which is the I-405 Sepulveda Pass Express Lanes project. So this is another Measure M project. Metro, in coordination with Caltrans, is evaluating alternatives to convert the existing HOV lanes to express lanes between the 101 and the 10. So we anticipate holding public scoping later this summer. And when you get your emails thanking you for coming today, you will also get an option and a link to click in to receive updates on the 405 Express Lanes project. And so I really encourage all of you to do that and get engaged with that project. They are different efforts, they are separate projects because the 405 is a complex corridor and we need a variety of different solutions to try to solve the congestion along the corridor. So again, stay in touch. There's our email address and we'll be sharing more information. So make sure that you opt in to get those updates in the future. Next slide. So I've talked a lot today about the need to stay in touch with us. So here is how you can connect with us. You can call our hotline, which is 213-922-7375. You can email us at sepulvedatransit@metro.net. You can visit our project website. You can access the feasibility study that we've talked about a lot today. You can watch our old video. You can make sure that you're getting all of our emails. Eventually this recording will be posted there. And of course, you can follow Metro on Twitter and Facebook. So with that, I do want to say thank you to those of you who need to head out today and get back to work or wherever things may take you, and thank you. And I will spend just a few more minutes here putting Peter through his paces so that we can work through a few more of your questions that have come up today. So with that, I'll switch back to Q&A. Peter, one thing that has come up, and I know we've heard this in some of the community meetings that we've been part of, is concerns about tunneling through the hillsides. So there is a lot of anxiety and potentially some misinformation about, what the impacts of tunneling might be to people's homes and all of that, and very real concerns. So I know we talked about that during the feasibility study. You'll be looking at that issue again in the future, but are there some assurances that we can provide today so that we, let people know there's going to be lots more information coming about tunneling?
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Karen. So, we've alluded to a somewhat lengthy process of producing an environmental document. And one of the reasons for that is because there's a lot of work that goes into it, a lot of very careful work and consideration of a variety of different elements associated with the project. And that includes, in the case of a project that involves tunneling, understanding what exactly that tunneling involves in terms of the technology, as well as the area itself, in terms of geotechnical concerns and seismic issues, etc. And so the good news is that Metro is something of an expert in this area, having done more of this work in recent years than pretty much anyone else in the country. And it's also good news that we have a great track record of being able to deliver projects with underground tunneling that have been highly successful and that have been resilient to a variety of different issues. So as part of the draft environmental impact report, it'll be an opportunity for folks who are interested in exactly what we're doing in terms of tunneling and exactly what the issues are to read about the ways that we've discussed them. And I feel like it's going to be very, it'll be very helpful to folks who have concerns to understand the analysis that's being done for each of these alternatives that involve tunneling.
Thank you. I think we lost Peter's audio there for a second. Can you folks hear Peter?
Can you hear me now, Karen?
Yes. Yeah, there you go.
So would you like me to restate my response to that question, or?
I would ask our meeting monitor, could you hear Peter's last audio or was that my audio fail?
Peter was coming in through clearly.
Okay, thanks. Great. Of course, I'm at Gateway where I'm having internet issues, so apologies, everybody. There are a number of questions coming in around safety and security, and so I want to take a minute. That's really not Peter's focus today, but I do want to just acknowledge for everybody who's asking us about safety and security that Metro is committed to a safe transit system for all of our riders, and so that is something that our new CEO, Stephanie Wiggins, is very committed to. And so as we come back from COVID, as our ridership increases, and understand that safety and security are sort of paramount on our list as well. And when we move forward with the planning of this line and eventually to the operation of the line, that certainly we will keep in mind your comments about safety and security, but do know that we prioritize that for all of our riders today. So we have another question. I'll just take a few more here that I want to get to. And so let's see. Sorry, my questions keep flipping. Are there some things that we could talk about, Peter, in terms of first last mile connections? So we got a couple questions today about parking and what parking might look like at the future stations, and how will we be considering the ways that people get to these future stations? By car, by bus, by bike, however it may be, by scooter, all those different modes.
Yeah, well, I think the main thing to say is that we'll be considering all of those things. So none of these different investments in transportation infrastructure that we do at Metro exist in a vacuum. We can't simply, drop in these lines on a map and expect them to be successful by themselves. They require a variety of connections. We use the phrase first mile, last mile to refer to the fact that, after people get off the train, as they're trying to get from wherever they are to the train, there's a little bit of a gap there, perhaps a mile or two. And that means making a connection by some other mode typically than the actual line that they're on their way to. During the feasibility study, we saw that consistent with other Metro projects, the vast majority of people who would be using the Sepulveda Transit Corridor line would be coming from either other rail lines or other bus lines, the vast majority coming from other transit lines. Also a fairly high percentage walking and biking to get to stations, and a smaller percentage of folks expected to try to access the Sepulveda line by car. About half getting dropped off, half wanting to find a parking space nearby. So we'll be looking at station access to this line for all those different modes, for folks who want to park at the station, for folks who want to walk and bike to the station, for folks who are transferring from other rail lines, from other bus lines. Those are all things that we'll be considering, both from a design and from an operational perspective. And those are things that we'll be sharing with the public as well.
I apologize, my audio is freezing. Matthew, can you take the next question?
Hello, everybody. Sorry about that. A little bit of technical difficulties, but we'll continue to answer some of these questions that are coming in. Let's see what we can answer. This question is coming in from regarding capacity, both for the red and purple lines, they're end-to-end heavy rail. Since the Sepulveda Transit Corridor line is projected to exceed the ridership of both the red and purple lines, wouldn't that strongly suggest that the Sepulveda line should be heavy rail as opposed to maximum capacity? Any thoughts on that type of question?
Well, I'm not sure if I understand exactly what the question's asking, but um, again, the draft environmental impact report is going to be a great source of information about a variety of things, including ridership for the project. And as part of our modeling work, we're looking closely at Sepulveda itself, but also the adjacent lines. We want to make sure, as we did during the feasibility study, that that the Sepulveda line is a good neighbor to its fellow transit projects within the metro system. So, for example, that we're not overburdening the East San Fernando Valley line, and that we're similarly able to meet the capacity needs for folks who are transferring to Sepulveda from the Purple line.
Matthew, you're on mute.
Apologies, everybody. Sorry, we have a lot of different questions here. So I think this is also getting into sort of environmental issues. So has anybody studied the noise factor to the neighborhoods on either sides of the mountains as the trains go through the Sepulveda Pass? So perhaps touching and alluding to some things that we'll be studying in the environmental process, correct, Peter?
Yeah, I think our answer to that is very short at this point, which is we'll absolutely be studying that and look forward to information about noise associated with the alternatives in the draft environmental impact report.
Matthew, you're on mute.
Apologies all. I'm trying to get used to the muting and unmuting. Okay. All right, this one comes in from our friend James Okazaki. Would there be an opportunity to have a single seat ride from the Valley to Mid-Wilshire running in the Purple Line tracks? And how about from LAX? So sort of looking at that connection between Sepulveda and the Purple Line or the D line extension. So would there be an opportunity for a Y connection, such as what you may see over near the Crenshaw LAX or in the regional connector over near Little Tokyo between the existing lines as they intersect?
Yeah, it's something that we thought about during the feasibility study, and it's not currently under consideration. The one potential alternative that is similar to what that comment is describing has to do with the ideas for the southern portion of the project. Again, now what we're studying in the upcoming environmental phase, but if you take a look at the feasibility report, you'll notice that one of the ideas for the west side to LAX portion of the project is to bend the Purple Line to the south in order to connect to the airport, combined with a line that connects the valley and the west side. And so at this time, that's the only option for connecting the Purple Line directly to the Sepulveda line.
Great. And I know we have time for one more question before we will wrap up today. But this question has been asked a couple of times regarding the 5 route alternatives. The question is, are they all involving public-private partnerships, or are only the 2 PDA alternatives on the table being considered for public-private partnership? Could you clarify for us?
Yeah, so there's 5 project alternatives, and as I mentioned, they're being informed by both the feasibility study and by the concepts that came out of the PDA procurement process. And the actual design of those alternatives will happen through a combination of the PDA contractors and the environmental contractor.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter. And thank you everyone that submitted questions. We received pretty close to, I'd say, around 150 questions over the course of the last hour or 45 minutes. So we thank everybody for, submitting their questions. We're also going to be taking a look at the ones that we did not respond to directly today, and making sure that our team is just aware of the different issues that have been raised during today's meeting. And we hope to incorporate this into future FAQs, things of that sort, so that we can answer some of these questions over the course of the project. But we thank everybody for participating today in today's meeting, and thank you for the conversation and the thoughtful questions that everybody raised at today's meeting. And we thank you so much. Have a great day, and we look forward to sharing the presentation, both the presentation recording with you guys in English and Spanish by early next week on our project website.
Thanks, everyone.